flaming your tools?
No.
Let's talk about not flaming your tools and inject substrate controls into that process. What safeguard do the existence or the availability of substrate controls to type all the way through the process, what impact do they have on detecting cross-contamination if it occurs?
Well, again, they're an important safeguard, because if one were to cut the stain, wipe the scissors, for example, then those scissors would next see a substrate control. And again, that substrate control is very vulnerable. If anything is going to get contaminated, it's the substrate control.
Why is that?
Because it should have no DNA to begin with. I mean, it could. You could have a substrate control that had DNA to begin with, but assuming there's no DNA to begin with, whatever you put down is now its DNA. So in other words, whatever type now shows up could be it's become that type.
Okay, and let's stay on the same topic and not talk about flaming tools, but talk about just wiping tools with water.
Okay.
You have a three-step wiping process. If one were to just wipe with water and systematically alternate between an evidence stain and a substrate control, what safeguard does that substrate control provide in ensuring that no cross-contamination has occurred?
Again, it should provide a safeguard in that it should then monitor for any contamination.
And if the substrate controls test clean, as they did in this case, what assurance or what do you conclude from the possibility or that the cross-contamination did not occur in this case?
Again, it's another piece of evidence that you're not contaminating those samples.
Okay, Mr. Sims, next to the last subject here, in your conventional serology expertise, have you testified about the genetic marker EAP?
Yes, I have.
And how many times?
I couldn't give a number on EAP in particular, but it was a commonly used enzyme in the days that I did conventional serology.
And are you familiar with the scientific literature on that subject?
Yes, I am. I used to be much more familiar with it than I am now, but
Okay.
yes.
If you could describe the marker EAP and what a forensic scientist should be aware of in that context, what would be your brief statement of the use of EAP?
Well, I think one has to be very careful in interpreting EAP band patterns. It's subject to certain. It's an unusual marker in that there are certain intensities as well as band positional things that we have to take into account. I think Mr. Matheson probably went into that in great detail, but it's unusual in that the intensities are an important part of the interpretation and the relative instabilities of certain bands.
Okay, have you reviewed Mr. Matheson's records on this subject?
I have reviewed some of his records, yes.
And do you have those records with you?
Yes, I do.
Could I see them?
Mr. Scheck, you want to take a look?
Could we have these items marked as exhibit next in order, Your Honor?
All right, Peoples 273.
See, there is actually two items, Your Honor. I'll describe them. Mr. Matheson's analyzed evidence report dated October 18th. And I'll count the pages.
Is anything being put in that wasn't previously put in when Mr. Matheson testified?
No,
just-
they're the same items. We can refer to them, maybe Mr. Scheck can confirm they're the same items, I don't have to mark them then. Maybe we can refer to those
If
prior.
it's already marked,
It is, I just hadn't shown the exact exhibits to Mr. Sims.
I would prefer that we use the exhibits that were previously introduced through the prior witness
Previously
for
marked.
foundational matters.
One of the exhibits is an electrophoretic marked 224A.
all right, then you're withdrawing 273 at this time?
Yes, I am, Your Honor.
All right.
And you have the exhibit? We're going to have to mark Mr. Matheson's report because it's more complete than the exhibit that was marked, Your Honor. I'll count the pages.
All right, so we can keep them straight. Why don't we make the additional report an addenda to the original
Okay.
exhibit? Ms. Martinez, you have the designation of that report?
This item is 23 pages, Your Honor. You want me to go ahead, Your Honor?
You're on People's 218.
All right, 218, then the additional report will be 218A, the more complete report.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Sure.
Mr. Sims, have you reviewed Mr. Matheson's analyzed evidence report, now specifically with respect to items 84A and B, some typing that Mr. Sims did on some fingernail kits?
That Mr. Matheson
I
did?
mean, Mr. Matheson, sorry.
Yes.
Okay. And have you reviewed the electrophoretic, which is a picture of the gel that he ran those on?
Yes.
Okay.
You're referring to People's 223A,
Want to give
the electrophoretic?
224A.
224A. Got it. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Sims, I want to give you a hypothetical. I'm going to put the nail board up there, Your Honor. Mr. Sims, why don't I start with my hypothetical, and I'm going to, when the board is up there, I'm going to ask you to look at the board, okay?
Okay.
Oh, here we have it.
Yes, I'm going to direct the photographers not to take any photographs of this board. Thank you. Proceed.
Mr. Sims, have you had a chance to study the pictures along the bottom of that board? You've already described how those are your photographs, the top 5 photographs. Have you had a chance to see the 3 along the bottom of Nicole Brown?
No, I just saw him for the first time the other day.
Have you had an adequate chance to look at them?
I'd like a moment.
Okay, sure. Could we raise it a little bit, Your Honor? It's a little bit low for the jurors on the end.
All right.
Okay, Mr. Sims, you've had a chance to look at Nicole Brown's hands and the blood on them, have you?
Yes.
All right, this is People's Exhibit, which, I forget which one this is. Mr. Sims, could you tell me what the evidence tag says there on the corner?
220.
220. Thank you.
Okay, you've had a chance to look at those 3 photos, Mr. Sims?
Yes.
I'm going to ask you a question, a hypothetical question, and I'd like you to consider the following things before I ask you the question, okay? You've considered the photographs, the 3 photographs of Nicole Brown's body and hands on 220, right?
Okay.
Also, I'd like you to consider the fact that you observed no tissue in the nail scrapings when you saw them and you processed them for PCR typing in this case, okay?
Okay.
I'd like you to consider that your PCR results were consistent with the type of Nicole Brown.
Okay.
Okay. I'd like you to consider that Cellmark's PCR results were consistent with the types of Nicole Brown.
Okay.
I'd like you to consider that the 3 separate samples which were typed by you and Cellmark all produced consistent results, okay?
Okay.
I'd like you to consider the sensitivity differences between the PCR typing method and the conventional serology marker typing for EAP, okay?
Okay.
I'd like you to consider that Greg Matheson saw no tissue when he sampled from the nail scrapings before you.
With objection foundation.
Sustain, as to that last point.
Your Honor, there is testimony.
Sustaining the objection to that point.
Could we approach? If Greg Matheson saw no tissue in the nail scrapings that he
Same ruling.
sampled. Excuse me, Your Honor?
Same ruling, I'm sustaining the objection to that aspect. Continue.
Could we search the trans?
Proceed, counsel.
Is the if Greg Matheson saw no tissue,
Same question, same objection, same ruling.
if Greg Matheson only sampled blood when he sampled the nail scraping kits, okay?
Okay.
And
Still foundation.
Or
And finally, what you know about the EAP marker and specifically the BA pattern. Okay, we have all those things that I want you to consider.
Okay.
Okay, the question is, would you as a forensic serologist exclude Nicole Brown as the source of the blood under her fingernails and on her fingernail based on Greg Matheson's report and the electrophoretic that you reviewed?
Objection foundation is to blood. Source of what blood?
I think the question is clear to the jury. Overruled.
Given all those considerations, my answer would be no.
Okay. Mr. Matheson, are you part of some conspiracy to frame the defendant in this case?
Well, my name is Sims,
I
and
mean
no, I'm
Sims,
not
I'm
part of
sorry.
a conspiracy.
So you are conspiring, huh? Okay, Mr. Sims, you're not, okay?
We'll stipulate to that. So.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
All right, Mr. Scheck, do you want to begin now?
Well, Your Honor, we have some things that we have to show.
All right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a brief break to reorganize our exhibits here, so I'll ask you to step back into the jury room, please, and this should only take about 5 or 10 minutes. Be seated. All right, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, good afternoon again, or good morning. I'm going to take our break for the noon hour at this time. With regards to the jurors, please remember all of my admonitions to you. Don't discuss the case amongst yourselves. Don't form any opinions about the case. Don't conduct any deliberations until the matter has been submitted to you. And do not allow anybody to communicate with you with regard to the case. And as far as the jury is concerned, we'll stand in recess until 1 o'clock. All right, have a nice lunch.
That's because we're...
Sorry, Your Honor.
Now, as an expert in crime laboratory procedures, you would agree, would you not, that there are certain factors which can create a risk of cross-contamination when handling forensic samples in a laboratory,
Yes.
and that there are certain methods and precautions that ought to be followed to prevent cross-contamination.
Yes.
Your Honor, I'd like to, where are the numbers on this? I have a series of slides that I'd like to display to the jury and the witness. Should we call them collectively 1159, and then I'll do 1159 A, B, and C. Could we show 1159A? I guess this is the departure point for our discussion, cross-contamination factors. Could we now see 1159B? Mr. Sims, would you not agree that degradation of a crime scene specimen is an important factor to consider with respect to the issue of cross-contamination?
Well, degradation by itself is a factor in that if there's very little DNA there, one would have to be more worried about what could happen to that particular sample.
Right.
That's true.
And in this particular slide, in the box, red box number 1, I'd ask you to regard that as a blood swatch containing the DNA of person number 1. And then the arrow indicates a process of degradation where the biological material that would show up on a DNA typing test has been degraded to the point where it's not detectable.
So it's no longer detectable.
No longer detectable.
Okay?
All right. And a swatch such as the one on the right-hand side where the biological material has been degraded to the point where it is no longer detectable is the kind of sample that one should take great care in handling in a forensic laboratory.
Yes.
Because when you have a degraded sample like that, the dangers and the risk of cross-contamination increases.
Yes.
Thank you. Could we have 259B?
C.
C. Thank you. C. Okay. Now, another consideration in the question of cross-contamination is trying to separate those samples that have high DNA content from those that have low DNA content.
That's true. That is a consideration.
Because when one is handling samples that have a high DNA content, and there's an inadvertent transfer to samples that have a low DNA content, cross-contamination can occur by accident.
Yes, that is a concern. In other words, that the high one could contaminate the low one.
Right. And so, as much as you can, you would want to, in your practice in the crime laboratory, separate out those samples that have high DNA content from low DNA content when you're handling them.
Yeah, well, especially when you're doing the DNA extraction, that's where we are most concerned with that in our laboratory.
Well, when you're handling the samples when they're wet.
What kind of sample would that
Blood
be?
swatches.
When blood swatches are wet, and now you're talking about a swatch that has a lot of DNA on it that's wet, and a swatch that has a lot less DNA and that's also wet.
Let's make it, in this hypothetical, wet or somewhat drier.
Well, I think at some point you have to realize that it's like taking universal precautions. Sort of like when a hospital looks at blood samples, they assume every sample has AIDS. That's what's called universal precautions. And so you have to take what I would consider universal precautions, whether you've got a swatch that has high or low, because you don't know. You don't know the content.
This is the effort to separate samples that have high DNA content from low DNA content is a precaution you try to follow in your laboratory.
Yes, but that's particularly in our laboratory when we're talking about DNA extraction. That's the main point there, because that's when you turn this into a liquid sample.
When you are actually handling and examining samples, don't you try to take reasonable care to divide up those samples that have high DNA content from low DNA content?
Objection vague as to handling and sampling and
No.
compound, Your Honor?
Stop there. Examining.
Well, for example, when I look at a garment that I might take a blood stain from, that blood stain may be a high-level blood stain, but then I would also, right next to it on the same garment, have a substrate control area that would be considered a low level. So when you're talking about examining items, I see that as different than when you're talking about extracting DNA. Those are two separate issues to me.
When you would agree, so examining is when you're just looking at them.
Yes.
Then you get to the point where you might actually cut a sample,
Yes.
such as a glove,
Yes.
such as a swatch.
Yes.
Would you not agree at the point where you cut a sample that you should take precautions to separate items that have high DNA content and low DNA content?
Yes, at that level, I would agree with that. And what I tend to do is to work on one item at a time so that they're separated in that manner.
And as you indicated, that when you then move from the point of cutting the samples to the point of processing or analyzing them, you also want to take special concern to separate samples that have high DNA content from those that have low DNA content.
Yes.
You're familiar with something called the Amplitype User Guide.
Yes, I am.
What is the Amplitype User Guide?
The Amplitype user guide is provided by the company that actually makes the PCR kits that are used in forensic science, and that user guide is usually provided to the students who take the course.
This is like a basic fundamental text on how to use, in this instance, PCR-based techniques.
Yes.
Although the discussion that we're having about separating samples of high and low content and degradation would apply to RFLP testing as well as PCR testing.
Well, it is more of a concern in PCR testing, I would say that. But yes, it's always a concern.
Are you saying that it's not a concern that you could get genomic DNA cross-contamination for purposes of RFLP testing?
Objection argumentative misstates his testimony.
Sustained.
Now, in that Amplitype guide, is there not, at the very beginning of it, a section indicating special precautions? Recall that?
Yes, I do.
And in that special precautions, does not the kit indicate that performing DNA extractions from samples containing,
Sustain.
all right, do you recall any specific guidance given in the Amplotype user guide with respect to separating samples containing high DNA content and low DNA content when performing extractions?
Yes, I do.
What does it say?
Sustain. Want to just add a few foundational questions here?
Well, is this would the precautions listed in the Amplotype user guide be ones that you would rely upon as a forensic DNA analyst?
Well, I'd be careful about saying everything that's in there, but the bulk of that material, by all means.
Why don't I just,
Why don't you show him the specific pages that you're talking about?
yeah, we'll get it. Why don't you take a look at section 2.2.2 on page 2 of the guide?
Yes.
All right. Would you rely, and I'm calling your attention to paragraph 1, and call your attention to the, I think it's just about the last sentence there that begins, perform DNA extractions from samples. Is that a precaution that you would rely upon that's in the user guide?
Yes.
All right. And that precaution states that that one should perform DNA extraction from samples containing high levels of DNA, for example, whole blood, separately from samples containing a low-level DNA, single hairs, small bloodstains, etc., to minimize the potential for sample-to-sample contamination.
Yes, I agree with that.
And you agree with that, do you
Yes,
not?
I do.
And when we're talking here about extraction, we're talking about that stage in the process where you take the little cuttings and you put them into these test tubes,
Well, I think at this point they're saying you've already got it in the test tube.
all right, when you pour the reagents in,
Yes.
during that period of the analysis.
Yes.
Now, can we turn to D?
Oh.
Now, you have samples from different crime scenes.
Okay.
Would you take special care when examining the samples to try to examine them separately?
Well, I don't see how one could examine those samples, how you'd have to do it separately. There are 3 different locations that I'm seeing. I see a little blue car and I see 2 little houses like Monopoly.
There are limitations to computer clip art, Mr. Sims.
But there
Why
are
don't you assume the blue car white and
okay.
assume one of those houses looks like Bundy and the other one looks like Rockingham.
Okay.
All right? Now, wouldn't you agree that in terms of these little swatches that you get from different scenes, that just even in examining them, it would be good laboratory practice to examine them separately?
Yes, one at a time.
And wouldn't it be good laboratory practice when cutting these swatches to separate the swatches that you get from different scenes?
I think that again goes more to the extraction perhaps. That's what I did in this case as much as possible is I kept the Bronco samples by themselves. I kept the Bundy stuff by itself. I kept the Rockingham stuff by itself. The only time I violated that was the very first set of extractions when there was 1 Bundy drop and I think 1 Rockingham drop. But I think as long as you're doing them one at a time when you're cutting them and then putting that sample away and making sure you have a clean surface, I think that's okay.
Right. Well, we'll get to what you do and cutting them one at a time and keeping clean surfaces. But just as a general practice, what you tried to do as much as possible, even at the stage when you got the samples, was process the samples from the different scenes, each separately.
Yes.
And when samples first come into a crime laboratory, and you're, let's say, cutting swatches, it would be good practice to make sure that you cut the swatches from one scene separately from those of another scene.
Well, again, I think as long as you work on them one at a time, that's okay. I don't think it's bad practice necessarily to look at 2 swatches in a row, as long as you clean up where you're working and you clean up your tools between each
Well,
sample.
We'll talk about cleaning and changing gloves and the rest of it. But let's just talk as a general practice. You try to keep the samples from different scenes separate.
In general, yes.
Because, now let's assume that one set of samples from one scene are severely degraded, and another set of samples from another scene are not.
Okay.
Wouldn't it heighten the risk of cross-contamination if you sampled those swatches from different scenes in the same time and in the same location?
There's insufficient basis for that question, improper hypothetical cause for speculation, it's argumentative.
Would it heighten it under
Heighten
that?
the risk of
under that
cross-contamination. Yes, under that hypothetical.
Under that hypothetical, yes.
Your Honor, this is a point where I have to approach to clarify
What's the
something.
court reporter, please? Mr. Scheck, you may proceed.
Mr. Sims, if you had one set of samples, blood swatches, that were collected from blood stains that came from inside a house on a clean wood surface,
Okay,
and they were collected between an hour and a half and 2 hours before the time that you began handling the swatches, examining and handling the swatches, okay?
okay, wait, they were collected about 2 hours before,
Before you began handling and manipulating the wet blood swatches, okay?
back at the laboratory?
Back at the laboratory.
Okay,
Then you had another set of samples that had been collected seven hours before you got to the laboratory. All right?
okay,
That came off concrete substrates.
okay,
There's possibility of exposure to soil and bacteria
okay,
that were packaged in plastic bags,
okay,
left in those plastic bags for 7 hours.
okay.
Would you agree that, number one, the samples that came from those plastic bags that were collected 7 hours earlier, there's a good chance that they would be more degraded than the swatches that had been collected 3 hours earlier from inside a home?
Objection, calls for speculation, good chances, somewhat vague, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Well, in your opinion, as a criminalist, would you regard, one, the set of swatches that came off the substrates, put in the plastic bags, collected 7 hours earlier, would you expect those to be more degraded than the samples that had been collected only 3 hours before you handled them that came off a clean wooden floor?
Objection, it's incomplete about the packaging of those samples, Your Honor.
And those samples that came off the clean wooden floor had been put into plastic bags. Those were about at an hour and a half in that plastic bag for about an hour, hour and a half.
Okay, so as part of the hypothetical, the floor is very clean, the
Yep.
sidewalk is very dirty,
Well, let's just say dirty.
okay? But the floor is very clean.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the question is, would I expect the ones on the sidewalk that had been packaged to be degraded?
Ones in the sidewalk that had been put in plastic bags, right,
Okay,
for 7 hours
okay,
before you examined them,
Okay.
versus the ones that came off the clean floor that had been in the plastic bag for only an hour and a half.
okay, yes, I think you would expect the ones from the sidewalk to be more degraded.
Let's turn to, before we do. And it would be a good precaution in the laboratory, those samples that I've described, ones in the plastic bags for 7 hours off the dirtier substrate, ones in a plastic bag for an hour, hour and a half off the clean substrate, both came from different scenes. It would be good laboratory practice not to examine and cut those in the same time, in the same place.
Objection, same time and same place as compound, it's also vague.
At the same time.
Well, same time.
I'll take it
vague.
one at a time. At the same, in the
Same
same,
time is vague, Your Honor.
Wait, you guys are talking at the same time as well. Why don't you rephrase the question? It is vague as to when you say handle, I mean, do we mean
all right?
process them all at the same time,
Right.
separately, how?
if you were to take those two sets of samples that we've discussed, all right,
Okay,
and take them out of plastic bags
okay,
without regard to whether you handled one from one scene before or after handling one from the other, would that be a good laboratory practice that, withdrawn? If you handle them one from one scene, taking them out of the plastic bags, putting them in test tubes, right?
okay,
Then you took another one from another scene, took it out of the plastic bag, put it in a test tube, right?
okay,
During the same period of time, on the same work surface, without changing paper, without changing gloves, would that be a sound laboratory practice in your opinion?
Objection. During the same period of time as vague, Your Honor.
Oh, I think you understand the question.
I'm not sure I do, Your Honor,
Well,
I'm
why don't
sorry.
you ask for
Can you,
clarification?
can you just rephrase that one, or just repeat the
All right,
question?
let's take sample number one from the 7-hour scene.
Okay,
It's in a plastic bag, swatches in a plastic bag.
okay,
You're taking these out of a plastic bag, you have a piece of paper on the table.
okay,
You're wearing gloves,
okay,
plastic gloves. You take a test tube, you stick it into that plastic bag, and get the wet swatches by manipulation into the test tube.
okay,
That's the process you use.
okay,
You take that from crime scene number one that has the swatches that have been in the plastic bags for 7 hours.
okay,
Then, without changing gloves, without changing the paper below, you move to the plastic bag containing the samples from the second scene.
okay,
Use the same method of taking the test tube, going into the plastic bag, right?
okay,
Manipulating it so you get the swatch out. Then with those same gloves, right?
okay,
Taking the test tube and packaging it into a coin envelope.
okay. I understand that.
One second. Sorry. Why don't you just, in terms of my hypothetical, why don't you just assume that you handled the swatches that were collected an hour and a half before you got to the laboratory first, and then the other samples second?
So you did them as two separate sets, is that what you're saying?
You did plastic bag number one, you handled from this, that was the one that had contained the swatches an hour and a half old,
Okay,
right? Plastic bag number two came from the samples that were 7 hours in the
Okay.
plastic bag from the dirty surfaces.
okay. So as I understand this now, somebody's taking what I would call a culture tube, is that the right size?
The test tube.
Test tube. They're sticking that tube into a plastic envelope to capture the swatch into that tube,
Wet swatch.
a wet swatch. I would say one should change gloves between those two sets, yes.
Let's say you didn't change gloves.
Well, the other thing about blood is it's very visible, and one may look at the gloves and see whether or not there was any visible contamination that way.
If you didn't change gloves, are you saying, Mr. Sims, that that's the kind of laboratory practice that you would engage in?
No.
Now let's talk about let's turn to I'd like to go actually to, I think it's F. The one that's F. Yes. Now, samples that come from a victim and samples that come from a suspect. Assume they're blood swatches.
Okay?
You should handle those separately.
Separately,
Vague separately from what?
It's this thing.
Should you examine those separately?
Same objection, Your Honor.
Why don't you clarify that, Mr. Scheck?
Let's try this. Would you agree that items of evidence collected from suspects should be handled separately from evidence samples?
yes.
Because this practice guards against sample mix-up and cross-transfer.
Yes.
You have a protocol in your laboratory.
Yes, we do.
It's a detailed protocol.
Yes, it is.
Are you familiar with Section 6.3 of your protocol?
I don't know the protocol by number, but if you read it to me, I'll let you know, or you show it to me, I'll...
Section 6.3 of your protocol concerns the examination of samples.
Yes, it does.
We're just talking now about looking at them and examining them.
Yes.
We're not talking at this stage about cutting them.
Yes.
We're not talking at this stage about packaging and handling them.
Well, no, wait, we have to back up. When we're talking about examining them, there may be some cutting. I'm sorry, I
Okay.
agreed with you too quickly on that one.
Sorry.
It's, yes, we are talking about having the evidence out there and sampling it.
And this section of your own protocol is something you rely on,
Yes, it is.
something you think is a good idea.
Yes, I do.
And in your protocol, does it not state that in general, the examiner should examine only one item of evidence at a time,
Yes,
marking the evidence with a unique identifier,
yes,
returning it to its container before opening another item,
yes,
and, in particular, items of evidence collected from suspects should be examined separately from victim samples.
yes,
And that's a practice that your protocol indicates will guard against sample mix-up and cross-transfer.
yes,
And you think that's an important precaution to take against cross-contamination, don't you?
cross-contamination and sample mix-up, yes,
And mix-up of samples.
yes,
So, in terms of this logo, which we don't intend to have, clip art's limited, and this is not supposed to look like men's room and women's rooms logos. But you agree with this principle that one should separate suspect victim samples.
yes,
Now, let's turn to E. Now, wouldn't you agree that Of extraordinary importance is the need to handle reference samples, be it from a suspect or victims, separately from evidence samples.
Objection, handle, and separately or vague, Your Honor?
Phrase.
Just in terms of would you try to keep separate the taking of any blood from a reference sample in terms of the time and place from the examination, cutting, or handling of an evidence sample?
By that, do you mean, for example, preparing a swatch of the reference stain or the
Yes.
reference sample, that sort of thing? Yes.
That is a cardinal rule, isn't it?
Well, I don't know if it's a cardinal rule, but it is an important concept, yes.
That's in your protocol.
It may be the exact wording I'm not sure of, but again, I think it's important.
Are you familiar, did I give you the amplitype guide?
Yes, I have it here.
All right. Why don't you again look at section 2.2.2, special precautions.
Okay?
Ask you to look at sentence 1,
Okay?
starting with "it is important."
Okay?
Do you rely on that section?
Objections, vague, rely on for what reason?
Oh, well, obviously for the application of this process.
Let me make sure I'm pointing to the right.
2.2.2 on page 2.
Yes.
I do agree with and I do practice that the DNA extraction will be separated in time from the reference samples against the evidence samples, but the PCR setup of evidence samples, it says, should be performed at a separate time from the DNA extraction and PCR setup of reference samples. I don't follow that. Usually what I do is I put the evidence samples first in a set that I'm going to do the PCR analysis on, and then I get to the the reference samples last along the stream, so that you don't start upstream with the reference samples. Instead, they're downstream from that process. But I do extract them separately. Yes, I agree with that part of it.
Well, all right, let's start with this. So you would agree that it is important that DNA extraction DNA extraction of evidence samples be performed at a separate time from DNA extraction of reference samples.
Yes.
And this precaution will help prevent potential cross-contamination between evidence samples and reference samples.
I agree with that.
Now, you're familiar with the California Association of Crime Lab Directors open proficiency tests in 1988 and 89.
I have some familiarity with them, yes.
And you have studied the factors that led to false positives by different DNA laboratories that participated in that open proficiency test.
Objections, irrelevant, calls for hearsay?
Sustained.
Are you aware? Have you familiar with that going into the content yet? Have you familiarized yourself with the circumstances surrounding false positives obtained by the Cellmark Laboratory.
Sustained.
All right. With respect to false positives arising from RFLP testing, when a laboratory is handling at the same time reference samples from a suspect and evidence samples, are you aware of false positives ever arising in that context?
Overruled.
In other words, am I aware of any documented example of that?
Yeah.
When you were that specific, I couldn't recall that. I am aware of sample mix-ups, but I wasn't sure of the actual what got mixed up with what.
Well, before you came in here to testify, Mr. Sims, you were watching this proceeding on television.
Some of it, yes.
When Dr. Cotton was testifying, weren't you upstairs in the prosecutor's office watching television in terms of her testimony?
I actually spent very little time up there watching television.
Where did you watch it?
I watched some of it in my hotel room, and I watched a little bit of it when I was upstairs, but most of the time that I'm upstairs, I'm not watching the television.
Did you watch her testimony?
Some of it,
Watch cross-examination?
some of it,
Talk about it with the prosecutors?
a little bit.
In your reading in terms of forensic DNA testing, have you read literature concerning false positives on the CACLD tests?
Objection. It's irrelevant, calls for hearsay, 721 of the Evidence Code, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Were the false positives in the CACLD tests a matter of concern to people in the forensic DNA community?
Objection. It's irrelevant, calls for hearsay, 721 of the Evidence Code. Assumes facts, not an evidence.
I'm only asking if it was a matter of concern.
It assumes that he knows it. I'm sorry.
Yes,
You recall when those results were announced?
yes, I do roughly the date, the time.
And you recall that you mentioned Dr. Blake.
Yes,
He participated in those tests.
yes, he did.
He got a false positive in the first round, too.
I believe it was a false positive, although it may have been a false negative. I'm not sure, but he did have a problem on one sample. I
And he was
recall.
using PCR.
That's correct.
And Cellmark was using RFLP.
Cellmark, my understanding, was using RFLP. Dr. Blake was using PCR DQ alpha in a different dot plot format than is used now.
Did you hear Dr. Cotton's testimony with respect to how the false positives arose in the CACLD tests?
You know, I think I missed that part.
You did?
I don't recall hearing all that.
In your review of the literature with respect to the CACLD open proficiency tests, did you become aware of a false positive arising when samples, evidence samples were handled?
Objection. Improper foundation, 721, it's hearsay.
Sustained.
With respect to handling reference samples, at the same time, in the same area as evidence samples, all right?
Okay.
Isn't that a particularly dangerous practice because the reference sample has a high concentration of DNA in the whole blood?
Objection. It's compound, same time and area. It's vague, same time and area. Particularly dangerous practices.
I think he's already conceded that.
Right. Overruled.
It's also argumentative.
Overruled.
Now, Again, could you, when you describe the same, is it what, the same time and the same place? Is that what you're
Yeah.
saying?
You discussed before, remember you saying, pouring out a reference sample and making a card in the
Yes,
same
I-
area that one is then handling reference samples.
You mean that one is then handling evidence samples?
That's right, evidence samples.
Yes,
Thank you.
I think that would not be a good idea.
And one of the reasons it's not a good idea is that the reference sample contains a high concentration of DNA in the whole blood.
That's correct.
And a very small amount of blood, talking microliter,
Yes,
that is transferred to an evidence specimen can cause a cross-contamination.
that's true.
A microliter of blood contains how many nanograms of high molecular weight DNA, would you estimate?
Yes, that would be about 20 nanograms, something like that, per microliter, because it's about 20 microliter, or, I'm sorry, about 20 micrograms per mil, so you're taking it down. That sounds right, about 20 nanograms per microliter.
Could be
of
more.
Whole blood. It could be more. Some people have more, some people have less.
And did you hear Dr. Cotton's testimony with respect to how much DNA was in the evidence lane of item 52 in her RFLP test?
Objection, calls for hearsay.
Sustain.
All right. Are you aware of how much DNA was in the reference lane for 52 in the Cellmark RFLP test?
Objection still calls for hearsay, no foundation, calls for speculation.
It's also relevant. Sustain.
Relevant?
It's already in the record, counsel.
Well, that's the point.
You want to pose it as a hypothetical of a particular
Okay.
nanogram.
Okay. If there were thank you. It's a long day. If there's cross-contamination of microliter particle blood to a swatch, that could cause as much as 20 nanograms, 25 nanograms of high molecular weight DNA to be on a swatch.
Yes,
And you can get RFLP results from as little as 25 nanograms.
on a good day, yes.
Now, and of course, you can get PCR results on how much DNA?
In our laboratory, the limit we would test would be down in the, what we would call 300 picograms, which is 0.3 nanograms.
Let's talk small here. A nanogram is a billionth of a gram.
That's correct.
So what's a picogram?
That's a trillionth of a gram.
Can you see it with the naked eye?
You wouldn't see the DNA, no.
Could you see the amount of blood that it would take to, from which one could get, what did you say, how many picograms could you do?
300 picograms?
300 picograms.
Well, I think, make it a little clearer. From a blood stain that's about 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter, you could get about 2 nanograms. So that's 2,000 picograms. So I think that gives you an idea of how small we're talking about.
Well, is that something that you would suspect?
Excuse me, Mr. Scheck, I don't think Mr. Sims was finished answering.
Oh, were you finished? I'm sorry.
I guess I'm done.
Oh, you finished?
I lost the train anyway, so go
Well,
ahead.
let's get back on the train. The size of, you said 300 picograms?
Yes,
The size of a particle of blood that could create, from which you could extract 300 picograms of DNA, would that be visible to the naked eye?
I think it would be visible, but it would be a speck. I mean, it's very small.
Now, the amount that, of speck of blood that would give you 2 nanograms, it's pretty small too.
Well, now again, that's about a millimeter by a millimeter, and that's pretty small, but it's visible, very visible.
Now, let's see, I guess it's, let's turn to G. Another precaution that one takes to prevent cross-contamination is not to do PCR processing on multiple samples at the same time.
Objection, PCR processing is vague, Your Honor.
Sustain.
All right. In the PCR, let's talk about the PCR process a little bit.
Okay?
One stage, you would literally cut the sample, correct?
Yes.
What's the next stage? Would you call that part of the extraction process?
No, that would be part of the sampling.
Sampling process. What's the next process?
The next process, once you've got it in the tube, is to go through the actual extraction of the DNA.
All right, and you do that how?
Well, in our laboratory, we do that by a procedure that involves placing or adding to that swatch, that stain, a solution that has a soap, a detergent actually in it, and an enzyme that chews up the protein. And that releases the DNA, and then that excess protein is removed by organic reagents, and then we do a purification step through a ultracentrifugation through a membrane.
But just visualizing it then, you take a piece of that extract, you put it in one of these little microfuge tubes,
You take a piece of that swatch,
swatch,
yes, and you
put it in the
that
microfuge
tube.
tubes,
That's
and
the
then you
first
add all those things you were just talking about into that tube,
That's correct.
all right? And so you create a whole series of test tubes with these swatches.
That's correct.
And some of these tubes are the ones that you were talking about before that you were calling reagent blanks.
Yes, you would include reagent blanks in there.
And that would be just a tube that had just the ingredients but no swatches.
That's correct.
And when you're talking about some of those substrate controls, those would be those little tubes, but they would be the substrate control swatches, not the evidence specimen swatches.
That's correct. They would be in there too.
Right. And you would also, you mentioned something that you called a quality control, correct?
Yes, in our laboratory we run that.
And that's another swatch?
Yes,
And you cut that swatch up and you put it in another one of those little tubes.
yes.
And then after you do what you call the extraction process, putting the swatches in the tubes and adding the ingredients, what's the next stage?
Well, then after you've got that process, you end up with a solution that has just the DNA. And so then the next stage would be the evaluation of the DNA as far as quality and quantity.
That's called the slot blot,
Yes, for the quantity, that's the slot blot.
all right? Quantity is what we call a SWOT blot analysis.
Slot blot
Slot
analysis,
blot.
yes.
Did I say SWOT?
Yes.
Slot blot analysis. You do that for all the tubes,
If you go that route, sometimes we use a yield gel for
all right?
quantitation.
Or sometimes we've had a discussion of something called a yield gel, right?
Yes,
And that's a method by which you get an assessment of the total amount of DNA in a sample.
that's correct.
Well,
And
sorry.
also the quality of the DNA, whether it's degraded or not.
All right? And just so we understand what a yield gel tells you the total amount of DNA, but it doesn't tell you whether that DNA is bacterial or human.
That's correct, unless you do another procedure where you blot that gel and
Right.
test it.
And another procedure one can perform after the yield gel is what you call a southern transfer.
That's correct.
And that's literally one of those, like the RFLP gels or those little agarose, it's a little agarose gel.
Yes,
And you get little bands, just like we saw in the RFLP.
yes,
And those little bands, depending on how intense they are, give you some understanding of how much human DNA as opposed to bacterial DNA you have.
yes.
All right? Now, if you're doing a slot blot and you're doing 20, you try to withdraw. Each stage of this procedure, whatever you're doing, you're going to do to all those different tubes.
Yes.
After you do the slot blot or the yield gel or the southern transfer to that stage, what's the next stage?
Well, then you would move into the typing stage, and that would be, for example, the RFLP setup, which is the restriction, or if you did PCR, that would be the amplification of the DNA.
Right. And if it were PCR, the amplification of DNA, you take those test tubes and you stick it into that thermocycler machine.
Thermal cycler, yes.
That's what amplifies up, does what they call the molecular xeroxing of the DNA.
That's correct.
And if you were, doing X number of tubes to the extraction, the slot blot, then the next thing, when you did the amplification, you would take it and do it with the same number of tubes, right?
Yes, I mean, assuming you're going to do that with all the tubes, right? I mean, in
Right.
other words, you're treating them as a group, yes.
And when you amplify them up, sometimes that's referred to as amplification run.
Yes,
Now, in terms of this process, is it a good precaution to limit the quantity of samples you do in a single run to a manageable number?
Good precaution.
All right. How many of these samples did you do at one time the most in this case?
I have that information, if I can have 1 second to look it up.
Mr. Scheck will be taking a break at 2:30.
Thank you.
The greatest number of samples that I analyzed at one time, and this would include the stains and the substrate controls, plus a QC sample and an extraction blank. These were all from the Bronco, and I believe the number is 21.
When was that?
That, I can tell you, I think if you look at on page 34 of my notes. Yes, that was on September 21st, 1994,
What page is the note?
page 34.
You're familiar with the Amplitype user guide recommendation in terms of samples?
Yes, I don't know the exact number in there, but I think they do mention a number.
15?
15 sounds close to the right, but you have to recall that when you do this kind of test, you're really limited to the amplification of about 16 samples. Actually, not the amplification, but the typing, you're limited to about 16 at a time. So that might be the number that they're discussing, because you'd have to include a positive and negative control.
Well, including those.
Well, yes, 15 sounds funny to me, but it might be correct.
Yeah, I'll get a page.
Mr. Sims, can you tell us? What page?
Page 4. Number 14.
Is that two, okay. Limit the should I,
Yeah, read it to yourself, see if you,
See if that refreshes your
does that
recollection.
refresh your recollection?
yes, it does.
All right, the number's 15.
Yes, it says approximately 15.
Now, would you agree that when performing all the operations that we talked about in terms of processing the samples, it's important not to rush?
I agree with that.
These are delicate procedures.
Yes,
That the opening of a tube, popping of a tube and the creation of an aerosol has been known to cause cross-contamination in this process.
Objections, argumentative, no
Sustained.
foundation.
Do you know if the popping open of a tube can create an aerosol, which creates cross-contamination in this process?
now this,
Objection, popping is vague.
this would be a tube of DNA.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm aware of that, and that's why we always spin our tubes down so that that won't create that aerosol problem. So we always spin a tube down before we pop it open.
You have to be careful with exactly how you touch the tops of these tubes.
Well, I am careful about that, yes.
One has to be, an analyst has to be.
I think it's a good idea to be, yes.
Because just the touching of the top of these tubes and then the touching of the next one can cause can cause cross-contamination.
Well, not so much from the outside of the tube. I mean, it's not that there's a problem with it on the outside. As long as you spin that down, that's the main thing. So that you don't have any liquid up near the top of the tube. I think that's what you mean.
Now, let's go to H.
Okay?
We're actually looking at H. I'm looking at the clock before I go into H. This might be a good time to take a break.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our break at this point. Please remember all my admonitions to you. Don't discuss the case amongst yourselves. Don't form any opinions about the case. Don't conduct any deliberations until the matter has been submitted to you. Don't allow anybody to communicate with you. Mr. Sims, you can step down, and we'll take a 15-minute recess.
Would include the quality control sample, the extraction blank, and then substrate controls intervening the stains.
Right. Now, at the break, you and I reviewed your notes as to how long it took you to do that procedure with the 21 samples from beginning to end.
Yes,
And I think you began that on the 8th of September,
yes,
half day,
yes, that's what we figured.
and then September 9th, you said it took you all day,
Yes,
and then September 14th, another half day,
yes,
and September 15th, at least a half day, maybe three-quarters of a day,
something like that, yes.
and then September 20th, a half day,
Yes,
September 21st, a day.
yes.
Altogether, between yourself and Ms. Montgomery, who participated in this process, how many days did it take you to process those samples from beginning to end?
From the point of sampling to having a typing result on DQ alpha,
Yeah.
that was about 7 working days,
7 working days.
approximately.
Can you imagine being able to process those samples, 21 samples from beginning to end in one day?
Objection, calls for speculation,
Sustained.
imagination.
Sustained.
Now let's turn to, what is this? H. Now, there are other kinds of precautions that one takes in terms of processing samples for purposes of forensic DNA typing, aside from the ones we've previously reviewed in terms of which kinds of samples one would handle at different times in different places?
Yes.
Now, let's start first with aerosols.
Okay.
Now, one kind of aerosol we've already discussed is the kind of spray that can occur when one opens up a tube.
Yes, if one has not spun it down, that's a concern because you can get liquid accumulating it under the top of the cap.
And this would apply also to one of these lavender top tubes that contains reference samples.
Well, they're under vacuum, so yes, that's a concern when you open one of those for the first time.
And when you open one of those for the first time, one has to be quite careful about the aerosol of whole blood from the reference tube.
Yes.
And in pouring that out, let's say onto one of these paper cards, one has to take great care.
Well, one has to be careful about what else is in the laboratory, yes.
Now, aside from aerosols from liquids, can one have aerosols from dried biological particles?
I don't know if they're properly called aerosols, but you can have, for example, powdered blood, something like that. You have to be concerned about that.
Powdered blood would be small particles of dried blood.
Yes.
Now, if one were to take a test tube that contained blood swatches that had dried on the inside of the test tube,
Okay.
and then one takes a pipette, holds the test tube up and scrapes the blood stains out of the test tube with the pipette.
Swatches.
I'm sorry?
The swatches.
Swatches out
Okay.
of the pipette.
Okay.
You with me?
Yes.
Could that not cause an aerosol of powdered blood to fall on the surface over which the test tube was held?
Well, in my experience with that kind of a sample, you usually see some flakes. It's not as fine a powder, but you see more of like a flaky effect.
Could see a flake, but in terms of the dried swatch, could be an aerosol?
If, again, I'm not sure that's the right term, but if you're talking about
Particles.
airborne particles, yes.
Airborne particles.
Yes.
And the pipette itself is a flexible instrument.
Now, by pipette, do you mean one of those that has a disposable tip on it, or do you mean like a glass, can you,
Glass.
yes, well, it's not very flexible, it's glass.
Well, one of those thin plastic ones.
Oh, okay, yes, those are flexible.
Right, and they can flick particles.
Yes, yes,
Especially when you're pulling it out of a tube.
yes,
So that's another kind of aerosol, if using
Yes.
that definition.
yes,
And these are particles of blood
yes,
from which nanograms of DNA can be extracted.
well, if these are real small specks, I don't think you'd get nanograms.
Well,
I mean, if
again, how many,
Objection, Your Honor. You cut off his answer.
I'm sorry, did you
Thank
finish,
you.
Mr. Sims?
well, no, I was just gonna say, if you had a large flake, then that would be nanogram quantities, but
Well-
not the kind of minute specks that I think you're talking about. Those are not nanogram quantities usually.
Well, let's go back to our discussion of specks,
Okay,
all right?
yes.
How small a particle can one get to derive 2 nanograms of DNA?
Well, from that, if it was solid blood, it would be a very small flake, something like that.
Now, let's turn to paper.
Okay,
When examining biological specimens, is it not an important precaution to change paper just in examining each item?
I think that is an important precaution, yes.
So just so we know what we're talking about, let's say you were examining a blood swatch on a white piece of, what do they call it in labs, butcher paper?
Yes,
After examining that swatch, it would be important to remove the paper from which the swatch came before then examining another swatch on that paper.
yes. In other words, you wouldn't want to examine two swatches on the same piece of paper. I would agree with that.
All right? And in terms of, let's go back to our situation with the test tube, being with the dried swatches being scraped out with the pipette,
Okay,
and paper below the test tube.
okay.
Would it not be an important precaution against cross-contamination to change the paper every time you removed a set of swatches?
I'm having a little trouble conceptualizing what is that swatch then being directed into? I need to
All right.
get clarification on that.
There is paper, butcher paper covering a table,
Okay,
section of a table,
okay,
and then on top of that butcher paper is a rectangular bindle.
okay.
You saw bindles in this case, did you not?
I did.
Bindles from the Los Angeles Police Department.
Yes,
Bindles that contain swatches.
yes,
I ask you to assume that the bindle is on top of the butcher paper,
okay,
and that the test tube with the dried swatches is being, the swatch is being scraped out of that test tube with the pipette, aiming for the bindle surrounded by the paper.
okay.
Would it not be sound, fundamental laboratory practice to change the paper underlying the bindle every time you moved to a new item?
I think I would do that. I don't know if it's absolutely mandatory to do that because the bindle does act like a new piece of paper if it's big enough. But I think it would be a good idea to put a clean piece of paper underneath each bindle, yes.
Well, the particles or the aerosol may not hit the bindle.
That's correct.
And to protect against cross-contamination from those particles, it would be sound practice to change the paper.
Objection asked and answered.
Overruled.
Well, I think it would be a good idea to either change the paper or to put like a wipe or something, some kind of tissue over that paper so that you covered that area, yes.
Instruments. Withdrawn. Before I move from, now, in your laboratory, is it not part of your protocol that not only that the paper underlying an item that you just examined, right, should be changed every time you examine another item of evidence?
Yes, I would do that,
Isn't that part of your protocol?
yes.
And when you're cutting or sampling an item, you would change the paper for each
Yeah.
different item.
Yes,
And that would apply to a blood swatch.
yes,
That would apply to cuttings from a glove.
well, now, between each cutting, is that what you're saying? I believe that's what I did in this particular case, yes.
Now, instruments. There are various kinds of instruments that are used to manipulate biological evidence in a crime lab.
Yes,
Tweezers,
yes, or forceps is what we call them in the scientific world.
forceps. And is it important to make sure that you clean all instruments that are used in manipulating biological specimens?
Yes.
Gloves. Is it part of your protocol to change gloves every time you handle a different item, biological evidence?
I don't believe I change my gloves after every item. What I do sometimes would be usually to wash my gloves. And certainly if I had any indication at all that I may have something on my gloves, I would discard them right away. And after, for example, I've been working around the laboratory and handling doors and things like that, I would change my gloves also. But I don't believe I would change my gloves necessarily between each separate item.
Did you change your gloves between each swatch that you handled in this case?
I don't believe so. I don't think so.
Would you agree that not changing gloves, let's start this way. In handling a wet swatch, would you change your gloves between handling each swatch?
Objection, handling is vague, Your Honor.
Rephrase.
All right.
What part of the process are we talking about?
Removing a swatch, wet swatch, from a plastic bag, would it be sound practice to change gloves between handling each set of wet swatches?
Objection, removing is vague, Your Honor.
Well, I think if you mean by the scenario we talked about earlier where you're sticking the tube up in there, I think if there's any danger that you would have blood getting onto that tube, then I think that, and then you touch that tube, for example, that would be a good idea to change your gloves, yes.
And in the process we talked about where you're scraping the swatches out of the test tubes onto the bindle and paper, between each set of evidence items, would you change your gloves?
Well, now there, as you're explaining it, you're sort of, you're creating a situation where it's coming down onto your gloves. I'm not sure that the criminalist might have the material out in front of him or her so that they're really not having the particles come down onto the gloves. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Well, would you, as a precautionary practice, looking at the process we're talking about, scraping the swatches out of the tube,
Okay.
all right, dried swatches out of the tube, would you change your gloves between handling each of those items?
No, I don't think so, because I think one could reach into that tube and dislodge that sample in such a way that then one wouldn't get powder onto the gloves. I don't know that I've ever done that procedure, so it's hard for me to evaluate it on my own experience, but I think at least one might wash one's gloves after each item. That would probably be a good idea.
So your testimony then is you either change your gloves or wash your gloves between each of these items.
I think that would be a good idea, but again, it depends on how exactly that manipulation is performed.
Maybe I asked you this question, let me just make sure I asked you this question. Did you either change your gloves or wash your gloves between handling each swatch in this case?
Objection, compound.
Sustain.
All right. You testified a second ago that you didn't necessarily change your gloves between each item.
That's correct.
All right. Would you, between handling each of the swatch items in this case, have either changed your gloves or washed your gloves?
Yes, I believe that is correct.
So you were either using a new set of gloves when you handled each separate item, or you were using a set of gloves that you'd washed.
Yes, I was trying to save the taxpayers a little money by washing them.
Okay. Now, agree that with respect to, well, actually, we move to I. Viewing each of these different factors in terms of cross-contamination, okay?
Okay.
Starting to the right hand of that white line, right?
Okay.
The first one, we were talking about degraded samples,
Okay.
right? And we agreed that in handling degraded samples, that is, the fact that samples are degraded creates a risk of cross-contamination in and of itself.
Yes, there is greater risk with those samples.
And handling a reference sample, now looking at the test tube plus one, all right?
Okay.
Reference sample in the same area during the same period, either by pouring off sample from the, popping up the top of the tube, pouring it onto a card in the same area during the same period. One is handling evidence samples. That kind of situation can increase the risk of cross-contamination.
Objection, period is vague, Your Honor.
Oh, well,
Yes.
And handling samples from a suspect and a victim at the same time can create a risk of cross-contamination of samples.
Can we clarify a little bit about samples from a suspect and a victim? I think we had a little more detail when we discussed that earlier.
Well, you recall that discussion. It's represented by that logo without reviewing it all.
Yes, yes, I agree with that.
And then we talked about samples represented by that scale of samples with high DNA concentration and low DNA concentration.
Yes.
And then we talked about samples from different crime scenes.
Yes.
And we talked about handling many samples at the same time.
Yes.
Now, with respect to all those different contamination factors to the right of the line, those represent, in a sense, situations that can raise the level of risk in terms of making an inadvertent transfer of cross-contamination.
Yes.
Now, looking to the factors on the left-hand side,
Okay.
if you combine the creation of an aerosol,
Excuse me, counsel. This witness has never adopted your characterization of aerosol. Airborne particles, perhaps, but
Thank
not
you.
aerosol.
airborne particles, represented by the clip art of fireworks.
I like that.
Thank you. All right, talking about airborne particles, all right?
Okay.
Combining that with any of these other situations to the right of the line, that is a sort of a mechanism of transfer that would increase the risk of cross-contamination.
Yes.
And the paper. You recall our discussion about not changing paper.
Yes.
If you combine not changing paper with each of those situations, that is a mechanism of transfer that can increase the risk of cross-contamination.
Yes.
And with respect to the Bunsen burner representing the cleaning of instruments, if one does not adequately clean instruments, that can be a mechanism of transfer that facilitates cross-contamination, raises the level of risk in the other situations to the right of that white line.
Yes.
And with respect to gloves, either not changing gloves or washing gloves.
Right.
Okay? Between samples, combined with any of those other factors to the right of the line, can become a mechanism of transfer for cross-contamination?
Yes.
Let's turn to note-taking.
Okay.
Your protocol has a section dealing with note-taking.
Yes.
Are you familiar with it?
Yes, I am.
Do you rely on it?
Yes, I do.
Good. Would you agree, and I'm now referring to section 7.3 of your protocol, that the functions of note-taking are to support the conclusions in the laboratory report, to permit internal review of the work product, to allow reevaluation of the data by outside scientific observers, and to provide a foundation for the introduction of work product into court?
Yes.
Do you agree that notes are to be made at the time the work is done, and to accurately reflect what was done?
Yes.
So the way that you filled out notes in this case is that you would perform a procedure, and then after performing the procedure, you would write down what you did,
Yes.
and write that down in detail,
Yes.
including, for example, changing or washing gloves.
Yes, in some instances, I did that early on, and then as things became more routine, I just kind of knew that that was part of the routine.
And would you agree that for casework, analytical notes should be recorded on DNA case note forms or the appropriate run sheet or checklist? Each page should be numbered,
Yes.
dated,
Yes.
and initialed by the analyst.
Yes.
And handwritten notes should be made in ink.
Yes.
It's a fundamental. You've been working in criminalistic labs for how long?
Almost, well, 19 years.
All right. And when you make your initials on various pieces of packaging, you do them in ink.
Yes, it would be rare that I'd ever have a pencil around these in my lab.
And corrections
Yes.
should be made by lining through the original, so the original text is still visible,
Yes.
and initialing the correction.
Yes.
And that's a precaution that criminalists take to ensure chain of custody,
Yes.
Objection that's argumentative, also relevant beyond the scope.
and with respect, do you rely on the section of your protocol entitled Documentation, Section 3.3?
Yes, I do.
Would you agree that note-keeping is defined as documentation of work as performed?
Yes.
And as performed means both that the record is made at the time the work is done,
Yes.
and what is recorded is what is actually done.
Yes.
Now, you reviewed bindles from the Los Angeles Police Department in this case,
Yes.
bindles that contain swatches,
Yes.
and the initials on those bindles were in pencil.
I think that most of the DF ones were in pencil, as I recall.
And those bindles didn't have dates.
I think a couple of them did, but I don't. I certainly, you asked me earlier if I saw any with the June dates, and I don't think I had any with the June dates on them, if that's your.
Did you see one bindle with the initials AM for Andrea Mazzola? Any of the swatches you had?
No, I don't recall seeing AM on any of those bindles.
Now, you have a manual for your laboratory,
Yes.
and as we agreed before, it's detailed.
Yes.
Everyone in the laboratory is familiar with that manual.
Yes, they should be.
And the provisions of that manual are not just guidelines that analysts are free to ignore if they feel they want to.
That's correct. They cannot ignore those.
And would you agree, as an expert in crime lab procedure, that being careful and paying attention to detail in the handling and the documentation of samples is very important?
Yes.
And that being sloppy about the handling of biological samples with respect to DNA testing is something that should be avoided
Yes.
because of the dangers of cross-contamination, or at least that's certainly one of the reasons.
That's one of the reasons, yes.
And when we talk about inadvertent transfers, would you agree that sometimes one makes accidents in the handling of samples that one is aware of?
Yes.
You might be aware that you saw some particle of blood, for example, on a glove,
Yes.
but accidents can happen that you're not aware of
Yes.
in the handling and the manipulation of samples.
Yes.
And it is for that reason that it is important to follow the precautions that we reviewed so far this afternoon.
Well, there's a lot more to that, but yes, that's part of it.
And in terms of, at the end of a DNA analysis, when you're looking at an autorad or a typing strip, and there is some indication in your controls, positive control, a negative control, a quality control sample, of an irregularity, it is often difficult to go back and figure out what stage of the process went wrong that caused that irregularity.
It can be difficult, but one can take a systematic approach to that and track back and perform the different parts of the experiment. And also, if one has, for example, extracted DNA or raw material, one can repeat that analysis. That could be part of the way of tracking that back. You may not figure out exactly what happened, but then you could still get the correct result, for
For
example.
example, on these DNA typing strips for PCR, one sees dots.
Yes.
And when certain dots light up, that's an indication that perhaps some amount of DNA associated with an allele has been detected.
Yes.
But sometimes dots can light up, and one wonders whether or not that is DNA that really comes from the starting material that you're examining, as opposed to something that may be just what's called an artifact in the process.
Injection, compound?
Sustain, rephrase the question.
What is, can dots light up on that PCR strip and it not be the DNA from the starting material?
Yes. That could happen, for example, if you had a mix-up of sample or something like that. Yes.
Or it could happen from some kind of contaminant that gets into the reagents.
Yes.
It can happen from some cross-contamination in the handling, in the extraction, cutting and extraction of the samples.
Yes.
But when one starts the reconstruction from looking at that dot blot,
Okay.
it can often be difficult to figure out exactly what occurred to cause the dot to appear.
Sometimes it is difficult, yes.
Now, let's talk for a second about your training in forensic DNA analysis.
Okay.
You testified that you started at the Department of Justice in 1990.
Yes, in January of 1990.
And was that your first exposure to doing forensic DNA analysis?
No. Well, as far as doing it, my first training in DNA went back to 1988. but that was a class that I took in how to perform DNA analysis. But my first job involving DNA analysis was 1990, yes.
And that's when you started at the Department of Justice.
Yes,
But you did not begin to do casework in January of 1990.
that's correct.
You began a process of training.
Yes,
And could you describe for us, and you didn't, I think you told us in direct examination that you didn't begin doing casework until May or June of 1993.
92.
92, I'm sorry. So how long was that from the time you first started at the DOJ lab?
About 2 years, a little over 2 years.
But before you started at the DOJ lab, did you have extensive experience in crime lab procedures?
Yes.
How many years?
Well, as part of all the time that I was in criminalistics, so that would be, what now, about 14 years of experience in criminalistics before I went to the Department of Justice, something like that.
Doing conventional serological testing?
Yes,
And dealing with biological specimens?
yes,
But you did not begin doing casework until you finished 2 years of training.
that's correct.
And when you did your training, did you receive guidance from people that had PhDs or doctorate degrees?
Yes,
People who had training in molecular biology?
yes,
People who had doctorate degrees in population genetics?
yes,
And you, I think the phrase you used on direct examination when Mr. Harmon was asking you why it took so long, you said something to the effect that it's important to know what makes a good blood stain into a bad blood stain.
yes. That was part of, I think, when we were discussing our environmental abuse experiment, where we exposed blood and semen stains to a wide variety of environmental conditions to evaluate whether or not we would get the right or the wrong answer.
And so it would be important for criminalists who are collecting, packaging, processing, extracting, performing DNA analysis to have an understanding of what causes degradation in samples.
Objection, misstates the testimony, it's argumentative.
I'm asking him if that's true.
Yes, I think that would be important, that people collecting biological evidence should have some basic understanding.
They should have a basic understanding of what can cause cross-contamination in
Yes,
forensic DNA analysis.
yes,
And this, I think you indicated, is only the 8th time you have testified in court about your forensic DNA work.
well, I think this is now 9.
9. Now, you talked on direct examination about laboratory accreditation.
Yes,
You indicated that the Department of Justice is accredited by what's known as ASCLD Lab.
the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors Laboratory Accreditation Board.
Yes. Now, this is a group of people that are doing forensic work.
Yes,
And I think you said that, I think it was to save me some time, that with respect to the recommendations of the National Research Council of the National Academy of Science in their book, DNA Technology in Forensic Science, that you don't rely on any of it.
Objection, that misstates the testimony that he gave.
I think as I understand Mr. Harmon's question was, did I rely on anything in there to reach the conclusions that I reached in this case?
Oh, okay. Are you familiar with the recommendations in that book concerning laboratory accreditation?
Objection, it's irrelevant, it's hearsay under 721.
Or will? You
No
can answer the
foundation.
question. You can answer the question.
I'd,
Yes or no, are you familiar with it?
no.
Didn't read that chapter?
Well, I don't remember the administrative stuff.
recall reading a chapter 4 called Ensuring High Standards.
Yes, I remember this chapter.
May I approach? Oops. Do you know whether you would rely on any part of this chapter as in terms of your expertise in criminalistics?
It's irrelevant what he would
I'm
rely
trying
on.
to save time.
It's hearsay, it's foundational, 721.
I think you'd have to ask me on a point-by-point basis,
Some you would rely on, some you wouldn't.
depending on what that section says.
Mr. Scheck, why don't we move on? I'm not overly optimistic on this line of questioning.
Well, let me just try. Try a little bit.
Well, you haven't got, we don't have,
Objection to
wait, I'm discussing this with counsel. I'm trying to give him some guidance. Why don't you sit down? I'm not overly optimistic, Mr. Scheck, given the lack of the foundation at this point. So why don't we move on?
Okay, I've located the sentence. Let me just ask this one and then I'll move on around. Let me call your attention to...
Ask him if it refreshes his recollection
Yes.
whether or not he relied upon that.
Yes, that's exactly what I mean.
No, don't read it, let him read it.
I'm not. I'm pointing him out. Let me just call your attention to the sentence, on page 102 in the section dealing with establishing standards in forensic DNA typing, starting at the bottom of the page, moving into the top of page 103.
He's reading parts of the
I'm
book
calling
right
his
now.
attention.
No.
Just
Go ahead and
that-
read it.
Just read that to yourself and then tell me whether you rely upon that section.
Objection, it's vague and relied upon it in forming what opinion?
No
Last
rules, counsel.
Have you relied upon that in forming your opinions with respect to accreditation of laboratories?
No.
Proceed.
Now, do you believe, you were asked questions about clinical medicine on your direct examination and DNA typing in clinical medicine.
Yes.
All right. Are you aware of standards or regulations in clinical medicine and how they compare to the standards on forensic laboratories?
No.
So the issue is, you know forensic standards,
Yes.
but you're not aware of the standards required of laboratories who are using DNA typing in clinical medicine.
That's correct.